Hey, Michael with XForcePC. Want to talk a little bit more about the RTX 2080 series graphics cards from Nvidia. And so we've been, doing a little bit of testing with those cards. And so what we found is in current X-Plane, this is September 28th of 2018, the 2080 performs about the same as a 1080 Ti. And then the 2080 Ti is just a little bit faster than that. In certain scenarios, which I'm not going to get into here, I can get into that in another video, we do see bigger or greater gains with the 2080 Ti, but for the most part, the gains over the 2080 are pretty minimal. It's only in certain special scenarios where I actually have seen much of a difference. But what I want to talk about here is what makes the 20 series different than the 10 series. You may have noticed that the model number starts with RTX instead of GTX, like all the other, not all the other, but many of the previous series going back to the at least to the 260s and the 270s, and for years and years it's been GTX, and then GT as well. And GTX would always indicate the real high performance end of the performance spectrum. But now we have the 2080, the 2080 Ti, we're going to have the 2070 as well, and these will all have the RTX designation. And the reason for the RTX designation is due to ray tracing. And what ray tracing is a new way of dealing with light in a scene. So I'm going to put up a kind of a basic example of what ray tracing is versus what we have today. But essentially, it allows the computer to compute what all the light would do in a certain scene, as opposed to just a light source shining on an object and that's it, you're done. We can now compute, okay, it's going to reflect off of that surface and then hit this other surface, and then that's going to create, this sort of bloom effect. And then, so you wind up with a much more rich scene from ray tracing. Now, I'm not sure that ray tracing can really be beneficial in a large flight simulator where you've got many miles of scenery out in front of you. I do think it could be used inside of the cockpit to maybe make the cockpit look nicer when the sun's coming in and the light's hitting off of various surfaces. That's where you would see the ray tracing come in. The big problem with ray tracing right now is it's not, for all intents and purposes, it's completely unavailable. There are no games that support it. No need to put in the comments, this one game or this other game that supports it. Yeah, I know there's a handful of titles that are supporting ray tracing, but for the most part, industry-wide, it's not currently supported. So if you're buying a card, based on ray tracing as one of your reasons for buying it, just know that right now it's not really available, not being used, and is sort of a future-proofing type thing. Not saying it's not a bad thing to have, or that it is a bad thing to have, but just know that it's not the right now thing. It's maybe 6 months down the road before you'll really start to see a lot of stuff with ray tracing. So that's the first real distinguishing feature of the 20 series card. Now we'll talk about the other distinguishing feature. So the other thing you get with the 20 series cards is something called DLSS, and that stands for Deep Learning Super Sampling. And this is something that's very important to X-Plane. This, unlike ray tracing, which I don't think will have a huge impact, this could have a huge impact. That's because the quality of scenery in X-Plane is heavily dependent on the amount of anti-aliasing you can throw at it. And what anti-aliasing does is it smooths out jagged lines. And I'll try to put an example of that up here now. Also, if you have some of these jagged lines, you're looking at it in a static picture. But if you're actually moving through space in the simulator, those jagged lines go up and down like an escalator. And off in the distance, when you have many, many buildings, that escalator effect going across all the vertical and horizontal surfaces of all those buildings in the distance really creates a distracting, annoying effect when you compare having your anti-aliasing cranked all the way up versus turned all the way down. Now, what DLSS hopes to do is sort of replace traditional, I think it's called temporal anti-aliasing is how it's done now. And that DLSS, I don't have ultra details on it, but it stands for Deep Learning Super Sampling. And what they do is they essentially take, if let's say you're running in 4K right now, they downsample that to 1440p. So that's a lower resolution. 4K is 2160p. So they render it at 1440p, and then they use this deep learning to sample it up to 4K. And so you're losing pixels when you do that. And that is how you get better performance. It's because you're dealing with less pixels. You're not dealing with 4K resolution, you're dealing with 1440p instead of 2160p. Now, you might say, well, gosh, that sounds horrible. That's a lower resolution. Why would I want that? Well, in the examples I've seen, even though it's rendering 1440p and upsampling it to 2160p, also known as 4K, the images actually look better when run through DLSS, or as good as true 4K running the old style of anti-aliasing. So while it might sound worse, in general it should be better, and frame rate increases can be 50%, in some cases 100%, in other words double. That's probably an extreme case, probably more like 30, 40, 50% would be more the norm. Again, like ray tracing, it's not currently supported in any games. Yes, I know. You could probably quote me a couple of examples where it's currently supported in some 1 or 2, 3 games. The new Battlefield 5 is going to support it, and the new Tomb Raider game. I'm aware of that. No need to tell me that. But the bottom line is, for all intents and purposes, there are no games that are currently supporting the ray tracing. So again, you're buying into a future promise, a future feature that isn't currently available. So if you have a 1080 Ti right now or a 1080, I wouldn't recommend running out and buying a 2080 or 2080 Ti right now. It's not going to give you any benefit because these features aren't currently available. DLSS and ray tracing essentially are not available right now. They will be available at some point, and X-Plane should support the technologies as well, but probably that's going to wait for Vulkan. So you've probably been hearing about how X-Plane's going to support Vulkan. Well, these are features built into Vulkan, so I can almost totally assure you that you're not going to see DLSS or ray tracing in X-Plane until Vulkan's implemented. Once Vulkan's implemented, it might just come right along with it or be rolled out shortly thereafter. So that's sort of my take on the new 20 series cards. If you don't have a system right now, it's not a bad idea to get a system with a 20 series card. But if you already have a system that has a 10 series card, it's doing what you want, there's no reason to run out and grab a 20 series card right now. It's just not going to benefit you really in any way. Hopefully that helps sort of explain. Now, I'm doing this high level. I'm not getting down into the weeds, and I'm sure I'll get some comments about how I didn't, get my slide rule out and get deep and dive deep into the technology. that's not what this channel is really about. It's more of a high-level overview, and I think most of the viewers here appreciate sort of keeping it at that. You don't need to know the nitty-gritty details of how this stuff works. More of the high-level overview is, I think, what most of my viewers are looking for. So hopefully this helps.